A construction worker thought he had just found an old coffin, but when he opened it, what came out would haunt him for the rest of his life. The sun was high over Cincinnati when the sound of heavy machinery echoed through the suburban neighborhood. The rhythmic grind of the excavator had become the background hum of the day, until Marcus Reed felt the machine jerk to a sudden stop. A metallic thud reverberated beneath the earth, dull but distinct, like something solid had been struck under 3 feet of soil. Marcus, a tall black construction worker in a dirt-stained safety vest, wiped the sweat from his forehead. He killed the engine and climbed down into the trench, brushing loose soil from his gloves. The dirt gave off that faint, damp smell only fresh earth carries. He squinted into the pit, noticing the shape of something rectangular, its corners defined by age and weight. "Yo, Mike," he called to the foreman, who was checking blueprints near the truck. "You better come take a look at this." Mike Torres, a stocky man with years of dust in his beard, stomped toward the trench. "What you got?" Marcus stepped aside and pointed at the exposed wood. "That don't look like pipe or stone to me." Mike crouched, running his hand across the splintered surface. The grain was soft and swollen from moisture. Brass handles, green with tarnish, clung stubbornly to the sides. His eyes widened. "That's a coffin." The words drew a murmur through the crew. Danny, the excavator operator, leaned over the edge. "You serious? Out here?" Mike exhaled. "Yeah, looks old. Maybe 100 years. He turned to Marcus. "We're stopping work. Get the camera, call the supervisor. Nobody touches it till we get this documented." Still, curiosity gnawed at them. As the others gathered around, Marcus felt an unease creeping into his chest. The coffin lay silent and fragile beneath the dirt, as though it had been waiting to be found. The supervisor arrived 10 minutes later with a camera and a clipboard. "All right, gentlemen," he said, his voice half excited, half nervous. "Let's see what's inside. We'll film everything, just in case this is something historical." The team grabbed crowbars and shovels, prying carefully at the edges. The wood groaned and cracked, releasing a musty breath of air that reeked of soil and time. A small crowd of curious neighbors had gathered by the fence, phones raised, recording every move. "Easy now," Mike muttered. "Let's lift the lid." Marcus wedged his crowbar beneath the hinge and pushed. The cover creaked open, bending against rusted nails. The moment the gap widened, a patch of faded cloth peeked through. Blue and white fabric, curled and brittle. When the lid finally gave way, silence fell. Inside lay bones, but not human. The skeleton of a large dog rested on a bed of deteriorated velvet. Around it, folded with care, was an American flag. A tarnished bronze star medal gleamed faintly beside the ribcage, and around the neck of the animal hung a silver collar, still immaculate, as if the years hadn't dared touch it. One of the workers cursed softly. "It's a damn dog." Mike took a cautious step closer. "No, not just any dog." He gestured toward the medal. "Someone buried it like a soldier." Marcus knelt at the edge, eyes fixed on the collar. Even through the grime, it caught the sunlight, glinting bright, unblemished. Etched faintly on the inner rim were the words, "Sergeant Rex, K-9 Unit, U.S. Army." Within minutes, police arrived, tape went up, and the site transformed into an impromptu investigation scene. A military representative, summoned by phone, examined the tags and confirmed the story. Sergeant Rex had served overseas and saved 12 soldiers during an ambush. His handler, William Hayes, had retired to this very house and lived there until 1995. Against regulations, Hayes had buried his partner in the backyard, unable to part with him. The officer sighed. The old man must have wanted his dog close. Technically illegal, but hell, after what that animal did, I can't blame him. Marcus listened quietly, his gaze still fixed on the collar. There was something magnetic about it, something sacred. When the officers finished documenting the scene, they placed the flag and medal into evidence bags. No one seemed to notice when Marcus's rough hands brushed over the dog's neck, unclasping the cool, heavy band of silver. He slipped it into his jacket pocket without a word. Later, as the site cleared and the other workers packed up, Marcus stood alone by the open trench. The last rays of daylight painted the coffin in soft gold. He told himself it was only a memento, nothing more, a token of respect for a brave creature forgotten by time. But as he walked back to his truck, the air felt strangely still. No wind, no birds, only the faint echo of the metal collar clinking softly in his pocket, like a chain that hadn't yet finished its duty. Marcus glanced over his shoulder toward the grave one last time. The shadows of evening stretched long across the yard, and, for a moment, he thought he saw movement near the open coffin, a faint, crouched silhouette beside it. He blinked. It was gone. He shook his head and climbed into the driver's seat, telling himself it was nothing but the play of light. Yet, as he started the engine and drove off, the silver collar gleamed under the setting sun, cold, alive, and waiting. The collar was heavier than Marcus expected. It pressed a cool crescent into his palm as he carried it inside, shutting the door with his heel and setting his tool belt by the mat. His little one-bedroom place had always felt like a refuge after long days on the job. Tidy, plain, quiet. A second-hand sofa, a small TV on a thrift store stand, a framed photo of him and his mother by a church picnic table. The late evening light angled through the blinds, striping the room with soft bands of amber. He turned the collar over in his hands. The silver had no right to shine like that after so many years underground. Even the clasp moved with an easy, almost noiseless click, as if it had been polished yesterday. The inner rim carried the faint etching. Sergeant Rex, K-9 Unit, U.S. Army. Marcus ran a thumb over the lettering. "You were something," he murmured, not realizing he'd spoken out loud. He carried the collar to the bedroom and set it on his dresser beside a small dish where he kept keys and loose change. The dish suddenly looked cheap next to it. He flicked on the lamp. The shade was beige and a little crooked, the kind that softened the light without doing it any favors. Still, the collar caught that dull glow and sharpened it, focusing a bright ring of reflection against the wall, a halo drawn in metal. His phone buzzed. Ma lit up the screen. Marcus answered, leaning a shoulder into the doorframe. "Hey, Ma." "You didn't call me back this afternoon," she said, warm and teasing. "Had me thinking you ran off to join the circus." "Was stuck on site. We hit something old in the yard." "Old like bones?" "Old like a coffin," he said, expecting the edge in his voice to scare her. But it didn't. His mother had worked night shifts for decades. She could handle anything. "Don't worry, not a person, a dog, military, they said." "A hero dog?" "Yeah." He glanced at the dresser. The collar's reflection had shifted, as if the light source had moved. "Saved 12 soldiers, according to the officer." "Well, bless his brave little heart," she said. "You eat? There's stew in your freezer if you didn't." "I'll heat something later. I'm fine." She was quiet for a beat. "Marcus, baby, your voice sounds far away." "I'm just tired, Ma." "You rest then, and say your prayers." "Always do," he lied gently, because it was easier than explaining the drift of habit. After they said good night, Marcus put the phone face down and stood a long moment looking at the collar. He told himself to stop staring. He turned, pulled the blinds closed, and went to fix a sandwich. Whatever was left of the cold cuts and a heel of bread, mustard squeezed into a bright yellow stripe. The fridge hummed louder than he remembered, a droning note that seemed to thicken the air. He shut it quickly, and the hum kept going for a couple of seconds longer, as if the motor hadn't gotten the message. He ate on the sofa, TV off, the house unusually still. Outside, the neighborhood was winding down. Someone dragged a trash bin to the curb, a car door thumped, a dog barked twice, and then thought better of it. He rinsed his plate and left it in the rack to dry. When he clicked off the kitchen light, the room fell into shadow in a way that made him pause. He flicked it on again. Nothing strange, just a dark room. He laughed under his breath, feeling foolish, and switched it off once more. In the bedroom, he lay down without reading, without scrolling his phone. He was tired enough to drop straight through the surface of sleep. But he didn't sink. He hovered. It was the sense of company that arrived first. That feeling, familiar and unwelcome, that someone else had entered the room while he slept. His mind reached up, swam toward waking. But before he reached it, the dream sharpened around him clear as a photograph. A soldier, young, then older in the next blink, stood at the foot of the bed. The figure kept changing in that way dreams do. Uniform crisp and pressed, then dusty and worn. Face shadowed, then half lit. Always there. Always watching. Beside him a German shepherd sat, ears forward, eyes shining like coin edges catching light. Neither moved. Neither spoke. And yet Marcus felt a message pressed against his chest like a palm. His gaze flicked toward the dresser. In the dream, the collar was upright, balanced perfectly on its edge, turning slowly. The silver brightened and dimmed with each rotation like a lighthouse lantern sweeping the room. The light passed over the soldier's face, and for a moment it was clear. Tired eyes, a mouth set not in anger but in grief, an expression that landed in Marcus's gut as something old and human and heavy. Don't take what isn't yours. He woke with a full-body jerk, the kind that leaves your hands reaching for something you can't name. The room was dark enough that he couldn't see the corners. He pushed himself up on his elbows and listened. The house offered its usual answer. Pipe settled, the neighbor's upstairs footsteps crossed from one room to another. A car rolled by 2 streets over. He looked at the dresser. The collar lay where he'd left it. Dream, he told himself, voice dry. He took a long drink from the water glass by the bed and lay back down. It took a while, but he slipped under again. Morning arrived gray and slow. The first thing he noticed was that the light in the bedroom seemed thinner, as if the window had been filmed over. He got ready on autopilot, coffee, clean shirt, safety boots, keys, then paused at the door, some small reluctance making him look back. The collar reflected a dull stripe of mourning, like metal under dirty water. He thought of the soldier and the dog and the way they'd looked at him. He shook it off and left. The sight started like any other day. The crew drifted in with travel mugs and sleepy jokes. Mike paced out the morning plan, pointing with the marker still missing its cap. Trench to finish, footers to check, inspector after lunch. Someone had brought donuts, already half gone. Danny slapped Marcus on the shoulder. "You the grave robber, huh?" Marcus made a face. "Don't start." "I'm kidding, man. You know the cops are talking like the news might come out. Everybody loves a flag story." Mike cut in, eyeing Marcus. "You sleep all right? You look beat." "Yeah," Marcus said too quickly. "Fine." Mike grunted. "Stay sharp. Trenches don't care if you're tired." Around mid-morning, the clouds gathered without quite making rain. The light over the lot took on a flatness that made everything look a shade off. Dirt more dull, lumber more gray, even the yellow excavator a little less yellow. Marcus worked a shovel against a stubborn root and felt a short, involuntary chill. He told himself it was the wind's fault. At lunch, he found a quiet spot by the stack of concrete forms. He checked his phone. A text from Ma. "You eat?" He sent back a thumbs up he didn't mean and a love you he did. When he pocketed the phone, he lifted his head and for 1 second thought he saw a dog standing just beyond the fence line. Ears up, tail still, a posture that said waiting. He blinked. There was nothing but a utility pole and the low, patient hum of the city beyond. "Yo," Danny dropped beside him with a plastic container of rice and chicken. "So, when are you telling us about your haunted dog?" Marcus snorted. "There ain't no haunted dog. Man, you take history out of a grave, that history comes home with you. Ask my grandma." "Your grandma said that?" Marcus asked, not sure why he was humoring him. "She said a lot of things," Danny admitted, grinning. "But that one I believe. Don't keep dead things in your house. Especially if they got names." Marcus chewed, swallowed, didn't answer. When the break ended, he stood, dusted off his pants, and tried to leave the conversation where it belonged, with jokes and superstition. But the idea clung to him like a burr for the rest of the afternoon. By the time he got home, the day had settled into a low sky and a street full of half-lit porches. He unlocked the door and stood just inside, listening. Houses don't breathe, not really, but his felt like it was holding its breath. He stepped in and flipped the living room light. It came on, then flickered twice before choosing a dimmer version of itself. He frowned, tried the wall switch again. Same result. Not off, not on, something in between, as if the bulbs were tired. In the kitchen, he set water to boil for pasta. The pot quivered against the burner and rattled a staccato Morse. He turned the dial down a notch and the noise softened but didn't stop. He opened a cabinet for a bowl and the door swung wider than he pulled it, bumping his shoulder as if pushed from the inside. The silly, immediate thought, cut it out, came and went before he could stop it. He ate standing at the counter and realized halfway through that he'd stopped tasting. His mind kept drifting back to the bedroom. After he rinsed his bowl, he wiped down the counter, hung the towel straight on the oven handle, and went to look. The collar was where he'd left it. The lamp beside it, when he switched it on, hummed a thin high note and then fell quiet. The light it cast seemed oddly directional, throwing a long, narrow shadow from the collar across the dresser top, like a compass needle pointing away from the bed. He picked the thing up, surprising himself with the care in his fingers. Cold, heavy, and possibly clean. "I'm treating you like a person," he muttered, setting it back down. He turned out the lamp. The second night started as the first had. No TV, no music, just the late hush of his block and the old small noises of the building settling. He turned on his side and waited for sleep to gather. It came and didn't. He slid along the edge of it the way a coin rolls along a table edge before it decides which way to fall. The whisper woke him. Not a word, exactly, more the thin rush of breath that carries one. He rolled onto his back. The whisper came again, from the corner where the dresser stood. A third time, closer, carrying a shape that could almost be meaning. He held still, heart climbing. Something shifted in the dark, the gentle sound of metal against wood, two pieces meeting and parting. Marcus sat up, throat tight. "Who's there?" he said, hating the cliché even as it left his mouth. No answer. He reached for the lamp and clicked it on. The bulb took a heartbeat to decide, then glowed. The collar lay an inch closer to the edge than it had earlier. He didn't move for a long time. He watched. He listened. He told himself anything sensible he could think of. The dressers not level, vibrations from the street, the lamp's chain brushed it. You misremembered. After a few minutes, he turned the light off and lay back down, deciding to be stubborn, deciding not to be run out of his own bed by an object. This time, the dream came quick. Not a soldier now, but the dog alone, standing on his chest without weight, muzzle inches from Marcus's face. He could smell a faint, clean scent like sun-warmed fur, something impossibly tender inside the fear. The dog's eyes were not accusing, they were asking. It took a long moment for Marcus to realize what the question was. Then the scene tilted, and the question became a command. Gentler than anger, but heavier than sleep. Return it. He woke wide. No jerk this time, no gasp, just awake. Heart slow and strong, having understood something the way you do when there's no language in the way. He sat up and looked toward the window. The blinds made a striped pattern on the opposite wall, darker than they should have been. For no good reason. He thought of the wooden American flag folded in the coffin, the care with which it had been placed, the hands that had done it. Okay, he whispered into the stillness, not committing to the word's meaning, only the noise of it. In the morning, he thought the clock was wrong. The bathroom mirror fogged too fast under the shower's steam, and when he wiped it with the heel of his hand, his face looked like it belonged to someone who'd been awake for a week, eyes a little sunken, skin drawn tight over the cheekbones. He dressed, ate a granola bar without noticing when he opened the wrapper, and left for work with the collar on his mind like a line of a song that wouldn't quit. At the sight, Mike gave him a longer look than yesterday. You sick? Didn't sleep great? Take a break if you need it. Nobody wins if you pass out in a trench. By late morning, the inspector had signed off and the crew moved on to frame and prep. Sawdust lifted in bright clouds with each cut. The air tasted like pine. Marcus tried to let the rhythm of the work pull him into that quiet pocket he knew so well. Measure, mark, cut, carry, but the pocket wouldn't hold him. He kept thinking about the way the collar's shadow had stretched like a pointer, and the way the whisper felt more like a stilled breath than a sound. He told himself it was grief, the residue of someone else's love, as if emotions could sink into metal and wait there. If that were true, perhaps returning the metal would set the emotion free. At lunch, Danny plopped down again, full of restless energy. So, curse lifting yet? Marcus managed a half smile. You ain't right. Listen, man, Danny said, tone softening. Jokes aside, if you feel weird, maybe don't keep that kind of thing in your bedroom. Put it by the door at least, closer to out than in. Closer to out than in, Marcus repeated, and the phrase landed in him with a small, precise weight. When Marcus came home that evening, the day's dimness followed him inside like a stray cloud. He tried the living room light and it went strobe, bright, dark, bright, dim, before settling. The refrigerator resumed its too-long hum. Somewhere in the building, a neighbor's washing machine entered the spin cycle, and for a moment he couldn't tell if the rattling was theirs or his cabinet doors again. He rubbed a hand over his face and laughed once, quietly, at himself. The laugh sounded like it had to climb out of a well. He walked to the bedroom and stood in the doorway. The collar looked smaller now, somehow meaner, like a ring that had tightened while you weren't watching. He didn't touch it. He sat on the edge of the bed and laced his fingers together and let the silence be what it was. For a few minutes, nothing happened. Then the shadows lengthened. They shouldn't have. The room's one light source hadn't changed. But the edges of things bled outward. Lamp, dresser, the frame of the picture on the wall, each line trailing a darker twin behind it, as if the room were making a second sketch on top of the first. Marcus's heart thudded once hard like a fist on a door. He stood abruptly, switched on the overhead light, and the effect snapped back to normal. "Not tonight," he said to the middle of the room, feeling ridiculous and strangely steadied by the sound of his own voice. He carried the collar to the front door and set it on the hall table where he put his mail. He left it there on purpose, closer to out than in. He went back to the bedroom and slept, not well, but better, and when the dream came, the soldier was again at the foot of the bed. This time there was relief in the face, the smallest loosening of the mouth, as if a needle had been lifted one turn from a tightened seam. Marcus woke before dawn with the word return in his mouth like a taste. He sat at the kitchen table with his first coffee and watched the light come up slow. The house remained quiet, but it was a different quiet, less like a held breath, more like a long exhale. He checked his phone. A message from Ma. "Baby, I dreamt of Daddy's old hound last night. He was sitting on our porch. Strange, huh? You call me when you can." He stared at the text, not sure why it felt like a hand on his shoulder. He answered, "I will. Love you." Then he stood, lifted the collar from the hall table, and held it against his chest for a second, not in attachment, but in recognition. The metal was colder than it should have been. He carried it back to the dresser and laid it down deliberately, a promise deferred rather than denied, and turned away. Outside, the morning had put the neighborhood back together. Kids on bikes, sprinklers ticking, the smell of toast drifting somewhere from a cracked kitchen window. Marcus locked up and headed down the steps, thinking of the yard behind the Victorian, of the makeshift cross, of the space in the earth where someone had once knelt to fold a flag. He didn't say it out loud, but the decision clicked into place with the certainty of a well-seated joint. The house had been speaking to him in the only language it had, light and shadow, hum and hush. He had understood enough to answer. "Tonight," he told himself, "tonight I'll go back." Marcus drove home under a sky the color of wet slate. The street lights flicked on one by one, but their glow looked dimmer than usual, swallowed by the clouds pressing low over the neighborhood. He parked outside his house and sat for a moment with the engine idling, listening to the faint tick of cooling metal and the steady whisper of rain against the windshield. He hadn't realized how tightly his hands were gripping the wheel until he forced himself to let go. Inside, the air was colder than it should have been. He hung his jacket by the door and noticed the silver collar lying exactly where he had left it, on the hall table, closer to out than in. He didn't want to touch it, yet his eyes kept sliding toward it, like the gleam of metal was a magnet that drew thought. The house smelled faintly of dust and old coffee grounds. He switched on the living room light. It flickered once, then steadied, its glow weak and uneven. He microwaved leftover stew, but when he sat to eat, every sound in the house grew too loud. The hum of the refrigerator, the ticking of the wall clock, even the spoon scraping the bowl. It was as though silence had thickened, and every noise broke it too sharply. By the time he washed the bowl and turned off the kitchen light, the rain had stopped, leaving only the soft drip of runoff outside and the distant hiss of passing tires. He stood in the doorway of his bedroom, looking at the dresser. The collar wasn't there anymore. Marcus's breath hitched. He turned slowly, eyes tracing the floor, the nightstand, the windowsill. Then he saw it, back on the dresser where it belonged. For a second, he thought his mind had tricked him, a flash of reflection mistaken for absence. He told himself that was all it was. But when he switched off the light, the air in the room shifted, heavy and alive. He lay in bed, forcing himself not to look towards the dresser. The darkness pressed against his eyelids. He began to drift, then a sound woke him. A faint scrape, soft but deliberate. Metal on wood. He froze. Another scrape, closer. He opened his eyes. The collar was on the floor. Marcus sat up. His mouth was dry, throat tight. He reached for the lamp, but before his hand found the chain, something else moved. A low rumble, like a growl, rose from the corner of the room. Not loud, but deep, vibrating in the walls. Then it stopped. He stayed awake until dawn, the lamp burning all night. The next morning, his face looked drawn, eyes bloodshot, the beginnings of exhaustion etched around them. He called in sick, something he hadn't done in years, and spent the day at home. The hours dragged, each one heavier than the last. Every small sound startled him. The creak of floorboards, the soft whoosh of air through the vent, the rhythmic knock of a branch against the window. By late afternoon, he felt something else, a subtle pull toward the collar like invisible strings tugging at the edges of his mind. He tried watching TV, reading, cleaning, but the thought kept circling back. Go look. When he finally gave in, the collar sat on the dresser, still and perfect, catching the dying light through the blinds. He picked it up. The metal was cold enough to sting. He turned it in his hands and saw something he hadn't before. A faint handprint smudged into the silver, like the ghost of someone else's touch. He rubbed it with his thumb, but it didn't fade. That night, the whispers returned. They came from everywhere, the hallway, the ceiling, the space between breaths. Marcus couldn't make out words, but he felt meaning in the rhythm. Anger, grief, demand. Then came footsteps. Heavy, deliberate, pacing across the floorboards of the living room. He grabbed a wrench from his toolbox and stepped into the hall. The lights flickered again. The air was thick with the smell of wet earth. The footsteps stopped when he reached the kitchen. The collar, which he had left on the dresser, now sat on the table, glinting faintly under the weak light. His stomach turned. He picked it up, and the metal burned cold against his skin. He dropped it instantly. It clattered across the floor and spun in a perfect circle before coming to rest, pointing straight toward the door. That night, he didn't dream. He saw a field of sand, gunfire, the deafening roar of chaos. A soldier shouting orders, his uniform torn, his arm bleeding. A dog, massive, loyal, fearless, charging into the dust, dragging another man to safety. Then silence. The soldier knelt beside the dog, tears mixing with dirt, whispering something Marcus couldn't hear. The image flickered, burned away, and he saw the man again, older now, digging a hole in a quiet backyard, his hands trembling. He placed the flag, the medal, the collar. Then he whispered, "I'll see you soon, partner," and covered the coffin with dirt. Marcus jolted awake, gasping. His shirt was soaked in sweat, and his hands shook uncontrollably. The collar was back on the dresser, clean and still as if it had never moved. Over the next days, the haunting worsened. He stopped sleeping. His co-workers noticed the hollow eyes, the slow movements, the silence. At home, shadows grew thicker. Sometimes he'd see a figure standing in the doorway, tall, broad-shouldered, wearing a uniform. Other times a pair of eyes glowed faintly near the floor. The smell of soil filled the air, no matter how many times he cleaned. One night, the whispers turned to voices. "Return him." The words came like wind through broken glass. Marcus clutched his head, trembling. "I will," he shouted into the dark. The room shook. The lights burst, showering sparks across the floor. The collar slid off the dresser and landed at his feet. He fell to his knees, hands shaking, heart hammering so hard it hurt. "I'll bring it back," he whispered. "I swear it." For a long moment, everything was still. Then the collar rolled slowly toward him, just once, an inch forward, and stopped. Marcus sat there, breathing hard, surrounded by shattered glass and the heavy silence of a promise that could not be broken. The house waited for him like a mouth of dark wood and drywall, a square, ordinary place turned cavern by a presence he could not name. Marcus stood on the threshold after work, keys in hand, and told himself not to be afraid of his own address. He'd made it through the day on caffeine and willpower, ears ringing, stomach hollow, the decision to return the collar pressing against his temples like a headache that knew his name. Tonight, he had promised. He hadn't said it out loud at the sight, but he felt the vow all the same, a nail-driven flush. Tonight I bring it back. He stepped inside and closed the door softly, as if loud noises might break something that was already cracked. The hall light flickered once and steadied. On the narrow table where he set his mail, the silver collar lay coiled like a sleeping serpent. He felt the itch to rush, to grab it and run, to end the story in one fast motion. But a whisper threaded the air, too soft to be a voice, too deliberate to be nothing, and his breath shortened. He swallowed, turned on every light in the living room, and went through the motions. Shoes off, jacket on the chair back, a damp cloth dragged over the counter. He boiled water for pasta he wouldn't eat and threw it away when it turned to a gluey clump. The night had weight. He could feel it settling on his shoulders. By 9, the neighborhood had sunk into its routine. TVs murmuring behind thin walls, someone's laugh on a porch, a car door thumping closed, the slow hush that follows. Marcus stood in the bedroom doorway and looked toward the dresser. He'd moved the collar to the hall table on purpose, closer to out than in, but the dresser still felt like a shrine erected by a thief. He turned away, came back, turned away again. Finally, he sat on the edge of the bed, elbows on knees, and breathed until the room found his rhythm. The first thud came from the living room. A second followed, closer to a stomp than a knock, the floorboards flexing with the blow. Marcus's head snapped up. A third thud shook a picture frame on the wall. The glass clicked against the mat and fell back into place with a delicate sound that made the heavier ones worse. He stood, hands open, palms damp, and took a step into the hallway. "Is someone there?" he asked before he could stop himself. The answer was motion. The collar slid across the hall table in a quick, small lurch and fell, the metal ringing bright against the hardwood. It didn't spin this time. It skated, sure as a compass needle, down the hall toward the front door, and stopped before the threshold as if blocked by an invisible lip. The lights blew. Not a flicker, not a dimming. Burst. A pop, like knuckles cracking too hard and glass dust hitting the floor in glittering breath. The house plunged into a darkness that was not absence of light, but the presence of shadow. Thick, textured, alive. Marcus's breath fogged in front of him. He understood the temperature drop not in degrees, but in the way the cold nested behind his ribs. "Okay," he said into it through chattering teeth. "Okay, I hear you." Somewhere between the kitchen and the living room, something paced. Not footsteps, boot falls. A measured, heavy cadence. 2 beats, a pause, a turn. 2 beats back, a pause, a turn. It mapped the room with authority. Another sound braided with it. Claws ticking on wood. A dog's gait beside the soldiers, quicker, softer, utterly certain. The paired rhythms approached the hall and stopped just out of sight, as if a presence stood at the corner, choosing whether to come closer. "Sergeant Rex," Marcus said, the name strange in his mouth, too formal, too intimate. "I took what was yours." His voice shook and steadied in the same sentence. "I'm sorry." The apartment door shuddered in its frame, a sudden crack like a palm against it, and then the knob rattled. The building's old hinges answered with a groan. The hall smelled of wet earth and old cloth, the precise scent of a flag folded with clean hands and buried with someone who had earned it. Marcus's eyes watered. He blinked the sting away and reached for the collar at his feet. Cold hit him like a struck bell. His fingers closed around the metal and images hammered through him. Sand grit on a tongue, the hot copper taste of blood, the weight of a body carried under fire. A dog's breath quick and steady at a man's knee, laughter in a barracks, a night watch changed on a muttered joke. The silence after a blast takes the noise away. They were not his memories, but they used his nerves like old wires and lit him from the inside with borrowed electricity. He staggered and went to one knee. The whisper became words. Not loud, not theatrical, worn raw by time and duty and love. "Return him." "I will," Marcus said. The words scratched. "I swear." Behind him, something moved at the bedroom door. He didn't turn. He didn't think his neck could take another shock. He stared at the black square of the front door and tried to understand the rules. If I open it now, if I walk out with the collar, if I head to the site in the middle of the night, what then? He pictured himself at the Victorian's fence line with a flashlight and a shovel, and the cops called by a neighbor who saw a black man digging where a grave had been. He pictured headlines he could not survive. The house seemed to lean toward him, hearing the same arithmetic. The boot falls resumed, this time impatient, a training ground cadence meant to shake a recruit awake. The claws ticked faster, eager, the sound of a dog ready to move at a single word. Marcus stood and found he was crying without sobbing, tears running clean down his face like the body had decided to lower pressure wherever it could. "I can't go tonight," he said, voice low and steady with the kind of truth that hurts. "Not like this. I'll be arrested. You know I will." He didn't know how you talked to the dead, only that you did it with respect. "Dawn, first light. I'll be there at first light." Silence. Not empty. Listening. The cold relented a degree. Marcus held the collar with both hands now, cradled it level, presenting it the way you present something back you've stolen. "Please," he said, "I'm asking you, give me until dawn." The house inhaled, the darkness thinned by a filament, enough to sketch the outline of the hall door frame in not black. Then a low sound rolled through the apartment, a growl pitched as low as breath can make, less threat than warning. "Do not fail." It pressed against his skin like weather. "I won't," Marcus said. "I won't fail you." Something touched his leg. It was weightless and undeniable, a pressure at his shin that mapped the shape of a head leaning in. It lasted a heartbeat and was gone, and in the absence he felt a grief so clean it took the breath out of him. He went to both knees then, not dramatic, not performative, just the body's clarity when it understands its place. "I'm sorry," he said to the floorboards, to the air, to the men who had laid the flag, to the dog who had not left his man even in the dreams of strangers. "I should never have taken it." A neighbor pounded once on the shared wall. "Hey, you okay over there?" The voice was rough with sleep and suspicion. Marcus turned his head toward the voice and found he could use it again. "Yeah," he called too loudly, the syllable hitting the wall and bouncing back. "Yeah, I'm sorry. Just dropped something." He was grateful for the lie's banality. He pictured how the scene would look from outside. Lights out, a silhouette moving in a window, a man talking to the dark. He wiped his face with the heel of his hand and stood slowly. The house loosened a fraction. The air warmed to merely winter cold instead of grave cold. Far away, a siren passed, no urgency in it, just a city noise doing its route. Marcus felt the rhythm of the boot falls one last time, a measured retreat to the living room, and then nothing. No departure, not absence, more like a disciplined stand-down. The claws whispered once along the baseboard, a last patrol. He moved by feel to the kitchen drawer and pulled out the candle his mother had insisted he keep for bad weather or bad juju, smiling despite himself at the memory of her eye-roll-proof conviction that the second could be as real as the first. He lit the candle with shaking hands and carried it to the hall table, setting the collar in the circle of its light. The flame fluttered and found its stature. In the tiny pool of gold, the silver no longer looked predatory. It looked ceremonial. "I'm not putting you back in the bedroom," he said, voice easier, almost normal. "You're going out that door in the morning." He left the collar there and walked the apartment once, touching the frames, the back of the sofa, the counter's edge, the everyday anchors he suddenly understood he loved. In the bathroom mirror, his face had softened the smallest amount, the hard angles of sleeplessness blunted. He brushed his teeth because routine is an act of faith, washed his face with cold water, and held his palms over the candle for a second to catch some human warmth. When he turned off the kitchen light again, the candle's glow did not have to fight the dark. It negotiated with it and won. He made a pallet on the living room floor with his blanket and a folded towel for a pillow, not willing to go back to the bed, not willing to be far from the door. He lay on his side, one hand extended so his fingers could feel the table's leg, proof in the blind that the collar was where he'd left it. Sleep did not come. Something kinder did, a long rest without dreaming. When sound returned to him, it arrived in the most ordinary form. A garbage truck 2 blocks over, banging the world awake. A dog collar jingling on a leash somewhere at the end of the street. A kettle starting up in a neighbor's kitchen. Dawn bleached the edges of things. The darkness did not retreat. It simply ceased to be required. Marcus sat up. For a heartbeat, he was afraid to look. The old child fear that the thing you've promised to do will be made impossible by some petty trick of universe or ghost. He looked. The collar lay where he'd placed it. The candle burned down to a shallow lake of wax, the wick a small black hook leaning toward morning. "Thank you," he said to the room, and meant it. He showered quickly, dressed without checking his phone, and wrapped the collar in a clean t-shirt, not to hide it but to carry it with care. At the door, he hesitated, then went back for the folded flag he kept in his mind, the image of it at least, and whispered the only benediction he thought might pass muster. "We'll put you right." On the step, the air held a chill but not the bone cold of the night before. The sky was the pale gray of paper waiting for ink. Marcus locked the door behind him and stood for a second, the key warm from his palm, the bundle tucked in the crook of his arm. He looked down the block. Sprinklers ticked. A bus sighed to a stop. Somewhere a kid laughed in a way that promised the day would become ordinary, as days must. Marcus drew a breath that went all the way down. "First light," he said, and started for the truck. Behind him in the apartment he was leaving to its windows and its chair and its good, stubborn walls, the candle's last thread of smoke curled and vanished. No whisper followed him down the stairs. No bootfall matched his. No claws. Only the quiet offered by a house that had been heard. And yet, because some truths have to be carried with you or they sour, the weight at his elbow reminded him who else was going to the yard. Not a haunting now. An escort. He felt it like a promise walking beside him, steady as a veteran's gait, alert as a good dog's. He did not look to see. He didn't need to. He turned the key. The engine caught. Dawn lifted another shade. He drove toward the Victorian with his jaw set and his hands easy on the wheel, the way you drive when you're keeping a promise that belongs to more than the living. The dirt road to the old Victorian was half drowned from last night's rain. Morning fog hung low, soft as breath, veiling the rows of maple trees that frame the property. Marcus parked the truck at the curb and cut the engine. For a moment, he simply sat there, the wrapped collar resting on the passenger seat, his hands still on the wheel. His pulse was steady now, though his chest felt hollowed out. He stepped out into the cold, the kind that bit clean instead of cruel, and pulled the bundle to his chest. The world was quiet except for crows trading hoarse calls in the distance. The backyard loomed behind the sagging fence, the patch of ground where the coffin had been unearthed dark and wet, like the earth still remembered what had been taken. Marcus walked slowly across the yard. Each step sank half an inch into mud, and every print he left felt like a confession. He stopped at the temporary wooden cross that marked Sergeant Rex's grave. The air around it carried a faint metallic tang, as if the soil itself knew silver. He knelt. His knees sank into the cold ground, but he didn't flinch. He set the bundle down, unwrapped it carefully, and lifted the collar in both hands. It gleamed in the pale daylight, flawless, indifferent to time. "I don't know if you can hear me," Marcus said, voice raw, "but I took something that wasn't mine. I thought it was just metal, but it was your bond. You earned this. You and your man." He looked at the cross. "I've been hearing you. I get it now. You didn't want revenge. You wanted rest." A breeze rolled through the yard, gentle but deliberate. It bent the grass in one direction and whispered through the trees with a sound that was almost words. Marcus's throat tightened. He pressed the collar to his forehead, the metal shockingly cold, and then placed it at the base of the cross. For a heartbeat, nothing moved. Then the earth gave a small sigh, the faintest shift, as if it exhaled. The air around him warmed, just enough for breath to fade invisible. He stayed on his knees. "You saved lives," he said softly. "You saved your man. I hope he's with you now." Behind him, a shadow flickered, not cast but formed. The shape of a soldier in fatigues crouched beside a dog. The outline was faint, almost transparent, yet it radiated calm. The soldier looked at him once, and in that glance Marcus felt gratitude, not forgiveness, because there was nothing left to forgive, but understanding. The dog's tail gave one slow wag, then both figures faded into the morning light. Marcus bowed his head, tears slipping into the dirt. "Rest easy, soldier," he whispered, "both of you." When he finally stood, his jeans were soaked to the shins, his hands caked in mud. The collar gleamed faintly where he had placed it, a small circle of light against the dark soil. He didn't touch it again. He didn't need to. On his way back to the truck, he stopped once and looked over his shoulder. The fog was lifting, revealing the pale yellow siding of the house and the yard behind it. The cross stood firm, the collar catching the sun. For the first time in weeks, Marcus felt the weight lift from his chest, the heaviness replaced by a deep, settling peace. By the time he reached home, the day had turned bright. Sunlight streamed through his front windows, flooding every corner. The house, once heavy with shadow, seemed open again. The hum of the refrigerator sounded normal. The air no longer bit at the back of his neck. He brewed coffee and sat at the table, letting the warmth soak through his fingers. When the cup was half empty, he took a small notepad from the drawer and wrote a single line. "Always return what belongs to the dead." He tore the page off, folded it, and slid it into his wallet. From that Friday onward, Marcus made it a ritual. Each week before dawn, he stopped by the yard with a small flower, white daisies, yellow lilies, whatever he could afford. He knelt, left the flower beside the cross, and said the same 3 words every time. "Thank you, Sergeant." No whispers followed him home after that. No growls, no cold air, only the faint comfort of knowing that somewhere a loyal dog and his soldier were finally at rest. One morning, as he placed a fresh bloom by the grave, he noticed something he hadn't before. The collar, still half buried in the soil, had tarnished slightly, but the engraving of the name Sergeant Rex shone brighter than ever, as if polished by unseen hands. Marcus smiled, nodded once, and whispered, "You're welcome." Then he turned and walked away, the rising sun at his back, its light spilling over the quiet grave where loyalty had found its peace. Marcus finally returned the silver collar, and with it the restless spirits found peace. Some treasures don't belong to the living. They belong to memory.